of Ulster, another university that's engaged with us. And I'll say no more and over to you, Jim.
Okay, just before I get into this, I just want to clarify that following Theo, restorative justice researchers do not have to wear navy suits and white shirts. Just that we both have impeccable style. Thanks very much for inviting me, Michael. This is a great pleasure to be here. Thanks, as I'm from Ulster University and I'm the director of the master's program in restorative justice there. My title was about the European picture of empathy and restorative justice, and I'm going to try and speak about this today. Empathy is one of those words that you think you know until you really start thinking about that, well, at least for me. And it was a great pleasure, actually, just suddenly realizing I'm going to have to say something about empathy, because just one of those words I've just taken for granted as a good thing, and certainly very much part of the restorative process, as Pete was talking about earlier on. And I started my thinking, my background is in probation. I used to be a probation officer a while ago before I became an academic. I started just thinking about some of my practices, and just stories came to mind. And one of the things that I'm struggling with, and I must say, the more I thought about empathy, the more questions that arose in my mind and answers. So sometimes, do we learn to be empathetic, or do we learn to block out empathy? Is one of the questions I have. Is it something you learn as a skill, or because when I remember talking to people who are known as offenders, about their offending, it was clear that, following what Pete was saying, that in order to commit horrible crimes, they needed to block out empathy in order to do it. I don't think conflict and harm is caused by lack of empathy, but I think it's sustained by it, I would say. I'll tell you a quick story that illustrates that. I was working with a group of armed robbers in a prison in Belfast, one that I went to visited. Now, this was many years ago when I was a probation officer, and it was a sort of victim empathy program. And the technique I was using was to get them to enact their offence, and the idea was then we would go through it and stop it, a bit like Boal's sort of approach, and say, where else could you have gone? What other decision could you have made? So it's really getting them to think from an empathetic point of view what they were doing. Anyway, they first enacted it. And just very briefly, it's a lovely sunny day, they were out in the park, they were drinking, and the drink ran out. And they had no money. So one of them said, oh, I know, there's an off-licence near here, and I know that this time of day, there's two elderly people serving at it. It'll be easy to do them over. So they went and got a hammer, and one of them got a knife, and then they acted out the robbery. And I sat and watched it. And I'm not going to repeat in this company the language they used, but they just walked into the off-licence, shouting very aggressively, saying, we're here to take your money. If you move, we'll kill you. And really sort of obscene language, and very, very aggressive, very abusive. One of them said, I actually jumped over the bench, or the sort of desk, and hit the old guy with my hammer and put him down. And then we took what we wanted to get, opened up the till, took the money, went out. And then they sat down, and after that, and they looked round at me. And I was just sitting there, flabbergasted, and I said, look lads, I am totally appalled. I don't know what to say. And they said, what? I said, just, okay, you robbed somebody. I can sort of understand that, but why do you have to do it in such an aggressive, nasty, cruel way? And I said, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And this is where, please don't tell anybody, this is where I went a wee bit off message as a probation officer. And I said, well, look, okay, let's put aside the rights and wrongs of robbing people, but, you know, let's look at how you might rob somebody with some empathy. And I found myself, I said, what are you talking about, Tim? And I said, okay, let me demonstrate how one does a civilized robbery. So I literally I walked in very quietly, went up to the desk and said, excuse me, I'm here to rob you. Now, don't be afraid, I'm not going to hurt you. I do have a knife up my sleeve, but I'm not going to use it. Sure, it won't be necessary. What I need is a couple of bottles of whiskey for £50. So if you could just give me that, I will be away within a couple of minutes. No one's going to get hurt. And I looked around with a big smile. That's how you do a robbery. And I said, Tim, you've never done a robbery, have you? You have no clue about what you're talking about. He says, the technique is to get the people so scared that they'll do whatever you say, instantly. And I said, yeah, okay, but what's the problem with what I did? I said, well, these old geezers might have a weapon of their own. You're giving them lots of time to get themselves organised to retaliate. You could have left yourself. They probably have a panic button. So you're giving them lots of time to press the panic button. By the time you walk out with your 2 bottles of whiskey, the police are outside waiting for you. You've got to do it quick, and you can't mess around. So they taught me that if you're going into the business of doing bad things against people, you've got to put your empathy to one side. Now, we had another discussion after that, when they said, you know, I do have a heart. I'm not a nasty monster. Every Saturday when I'm out of here, I go and see my granny, and I go and see if she's all right, and I go and see if she needs any shopping done, and I sit and talk to her, and I give her a cup of tea. You know, I do have empathy. It's just, if you choose to be a robber, you can't afford it. And then I started reading about, you know, how, and I think you mentioned it in your book, I came across it reading back on cognitive behavioral psychology, that researchers find in wars that a lot of soldiers in battle aim to miss the enemy because of their empathy. In battle, they're actually sitting, I don't really want to kill that guy. You know, he's probably somebody like me, with a family at home, he just doesn't want to be here. Of course, the researchers find that out and said, well, that sort of defeats the purpose of war. And what I understand happened was that they started training people, soldiers who are going into battle, to get rid of any empathy, to be hard. And they said, you know, this is the enemy. If you let them win this war, they're going to come and take over our country, ruin our civilization, rape our women, etc., etc. So you've got to be hard. So there are some cases, not just in the antisocial profession, but also in the social profession, where you need to set empathy aside in order to do your job. Some doctors would say that, to make hard decisions, you've got to set empathy aside, because if you did, you just never make a decision, or else you'd burn yourself out. You couldn't sustain the profession. So that's one of the things. Is it, you know, I suppose I believe that we're all, other than people who, you know, have disabilities or autism, we are naturally empathetic, but sometimes we get into situations where empathy is not considered an asset. So that was the first thing. And again, I'm never quite sure what the answer to that is. And really, that's when is it a liability and when is it necessary? And the other question I kept coming back to me, and again, this is just on anecdotal evidence, can we fully understand another person? Does actually this notion of empathy raise our expectations in a way that actually could be at times dangerous? I always remember a really good friend of mine. This was about 30 years ago. He was quite a young man and he got testicular cancer. And he was a social worker, as I was, and social workers are trained in empathy. And he said, you know, one of the frightening things I've discovered, lying here in bed, worrying about this cancer, is that people don't have a lot of empathy. people, he said all his friends, who most of them were social workers, when they came to visit him in the hospital, didn't know what to say, and when they did say things, didn't get it quite right. There's a little voice inside saying, I know what you're trying to do, and I know you're trying to be empathetic, but actually this is just annoying me, because you're not getting it right, and I don't want to have to explain it to you. And I heard that, can we fully understand another person? And one of the things that's helped me was a little bit of research I did into a gang in Belfast that was involved in violence on the street. And I worked with them for about 18 months, saw them every week. And one of the things we did was went on a one-night residential, because I wanted to do a really intensive discussion with them. And the discussion was, what would you need from us people who say we want to help you to stop offending? And we worked at this, and of course they had a load of things that they didn't want us to do. And I kept turning around, but what's the positive? What do you really want? And one of the things, they only actually said two things at the end of the day, would have boiled down to it, but one of them was, and I want to repeat this sentence just as I wrote it on the flip chart as I remember. We would like to see you make the effort to understand what it's like to be young, living in our communities now. We would like to see you make the effort to understand what it's like to be young, living in our communities now. Because here I was, middle-aged, middle class, very different. And we talked about that. I said, right, that's a really good sentence. I can get that. I said, you really want me to understand, you empathize with what it's like? No. You haven't been listening. The important word in that sentence was effort. We want to see you make the effort to understand. Because basically you will never fully understand. But it would be nice to see people making the effort. Because their experience of the adult world, even of those who want to help them, is they either read the book and thought they understood already, or didn't think their job was to understand somebody who's causing problems. Their job was to get them to understand how they needed to conform. So I've always remembered that, and that has helped me, because I think empathy is maybe elusive, but it helps me to think as a practitioner, as a researcher, as a teacher, that it really helps to show you're making the effort to understand somebody else. That creates relationship, creates some sort of connection, even if you get it wrong, because I think if you're making a genuine effort, people are understanding and forgiving. Then the other aspect of what I'm being asked to talk about is European, which is almost an impossible thing to answer, but I'm going to try anyway. But what I thought was, well, that's interesting, asking me to do a European perspective. It brings in the question of context. That what we're talking about depends on what context we're talking about. I'm from Northern Ireland, as Michael said, and everything is contextual in Northern Ireland. Two people could see exactly the same event and have a completely different interpretation of it, depending on whether they were Catholic or Protestant, Republican, Royalist, etc. And there used to be a column in a magazine in Northern Ireland which showed there's a Catholic paper and a Protestant paper, and reporting on exactly the same event. They put the two reports side by side, and you would say they're not talking about the same thing, although they were. So that's what interests me. What is a European context? Just to say why I think I can speak with a little bit of authority. I'm on the board of the European Forum for Restorative Justice, which is a sort of network organisation throughout Europe. I think 25 different countries of Europe are signed up to it. Recently, the International Juvenile Justice Observatory asked me to develop what they're calling a European model of restorative justice for juveniles. And to answer your question, that has involved me visiting two countries to look at their system in depth, Finland and Belgium, which I would say on the European mainland have probably developed a restorative approach within juvenile justice, or criminal justice most. But it's also given me access to research that's being carried out in Germany by Frida Dunkel, who's looked at all the countries of Europe, maybe 38 countries, and has looked at what is happening. And almost every country is doing something restorative, but it's pretty ad hoc, limited. But probably the two countries on mainland Europe who are doing it most rigorously and most in the centre of things are Finland and Belgium. So that's been an interesting experience, because I had to think what would be a European model. I've been involved in a European study into the training of judges and prosecutors in restorative justice. And that's when you realise, it's easy to forget this, the European model of justice is very different from the sort of British-American model of justice. It's very different procedures and roles and approaches, and we sometimes think in our culture that's the norm. Actually, it's abnormal from a European point of view. And more recently, I've been involved in a major European research called Alternative. It's a contribution to restorative justice to justice and security in conflicts in intercultural contexts. And in Northern Ireland, we're particularly looking at restorative justice in community, addressing violence, and also the politics of identity in Northern Ireland, which is a minefield. One of the things, for a typical person from Northern Ireland, in terms of identity, am I Irish, or am I British, am I Northern Irish, am I an Ulsterman? We have a complexity of identity issues in Northern Ireland. I think I'm going to quote here. This is a classic Northern Irish. Anyone who isn't confused by Northern Ireland just doesn't understand. And I think that's quite, again, what I would say is quite a useful thing to remember about empathy. Anybody who thinks they understand how somebody else is feeling is probably on the wrong lines. So that's just something that goes around Northern Ireland. But the one thing I think I am clear about in my identity is that I'm European. Now again, a lot of English people are not clear about that. But I am, and that's purely contextual. My experience as a child, I grew up in Africa. My father was working in Nigeria. And we didn't talk when I was growing up, as I remember, of blacks and whites. We talked about Africans and Europeans. You're either an African or a European. I respected the African rich tradition and culture, but I also learned to respect the European culture. I met Stuart here in the toilet earlier on. And
you don't want to talk about that.
Yeah, no, I've got a different story I want to tell you. And he reminded me that I was teaching in October last year in London. Stuart was at the course, and it was on my birthday. So Stuart, being a sensitive, empathetic person, said, "Did you enjoy your birthday?" Because I mentioned it. And I did, and I actually wanted to talk about my birthday, just while I'm up here, I might as well. Because I decided, RJC were paying my expenses over to London, so I thought I'd stay over. My son was working in England, my daughter works up in Hull, so they were going to come down for the weekend, and my wife Alice was going to come over and join me. So I had a great weekend in London, Stuart, thanks for asking. But actually, when I was thinking about it, it was, I suppose what I want to make the point is just, and this will make sense as we go on, not to take for granted the richness of the culture of Europe. And actually, London, I think, is one of the most European cities in Europe. And so in that weekend, after spending a pleasant day with Stuart, I went out to an Italian restaurant with my son in Soho. The next morning, I got up and went to see an exhibition, one of my favourite painters, Ivan Schiele from Austria, at the Courtauld Institute. And again, he's an acquired taste, but for me, he's an amazing draftsman. And if you're talking about empathy, I think he's great This was an exhibition of nudes, of erotic art, and it sort of displayed both the vulnerability and the resilience of the naked body of people being caught. And he doesn't paint them in a romantic, glamorous way. So there's a lot of empathy in his art. I decided I wouldn't put one of the nudes up, just in case. Then I walked down the Strand to the National Gallery, and some of you living in London will know that there's a great exhibition in the National Gallery of late Rembrandt. And I must say, when I think of art and empathy, it's hard to beat Rembrandt for the feeling and depth that he puts into particularly his self-portraits, but also portraits of other people. They're very, very moving, particularly when he was nearing the end of his life. Then that evening, Saturday evening, of course there's Dutch, we've got Austrian Dutch, we've had an Italian meal. That evening I went to the Old Vic, where Electra was on. Great play from Greece by Sophocles. And again, it's about a tragedy. It's about a woman whose father was killed, and then the killer of her father married her mother. And it's about grief. It's about revenge. It's about feeling stuck until somebody comes, her brother reappears to kill her stepfather, and then there's the catharsis. After that, a friend of mine was acting in it, so after that we went to a Turkish restaurant. And then finally, on Sunday, we did an English thing. Sure you'll never guess what it was. Typical English afternoon tea at a posh restaurant. So I'm just saying that it's interestingly, one of the things that's interested me is when we've been talking about empathy, as Theo said, almost all the writers, all the theorists, all the researchers have come from a British or American background. And yet we're part of a very rich European tradition. In fact, the word empathy, as people will know, comes from Greek and then was developed in German, Einfühlung, and then became empathy in English. So even the word is a very old European word that's been shared throughout the culture. However, restorative justice, the history of recent, obviously I would agree with Theo that restorative justice has been going on in communities throughout the world forever. But the modern era of restorative justice, when it became restorative justice, really started in ex-colonies of the British Empire, and probably driven by a certain amount of post-colonial guilt. And sort of started in sort of New Zealand, Australia, and went to America, where it encountered, coming from a very collective, communal, tribal, it went from there to a very modern, individualistic society, and encountered, I think, two main influences. One was the faith communities, people like Harzer, Mennonites, tended to be sort of more Puritan but progressive end of Christianity, and they could see the spiritual significance of restorative justice. But it also encountered this very strong culture within American society of therapy, psychology. And having gathered up those cultural influences, then came over to us and encountered the British, Irish culture. And so restorative justice has become very much an English-speaking discourse. I'm going to really simplify it. There is a psychological therapeutic discourse, which I think most of us today have been speaking within. Theo mentioned affect, script, psychology. It's true, there's a recent book that's come out on it, but actually it can be traced back to Sylvan Tompkins' research and writing in the 50s and 60s of the last century. Out of that has become the restorative script. And if you read sort of the theory of that empathy is a sort of function of positive effects. That when people encounter each other, They realize we have the same set of feelings, and we make an emotional connection, and that develops empathy for each other. And if that process is well managed through somebody trained in the script, then there will be a sense of healing. And basically, it's restorative justice as a means of helping everybody feel better, to feel good about something. Now, it encountered the UK system, which Theo's talked about, a state system. I think it's quite a strong state system. It emphasises reducing reoffending above all else in criminal justice. And as people said, it's very managerialist. People like to have statistics. They like to have standards of practice and targets to meet. So empathy there's a risk that in this system, empathy becomes translated into a performance indicator of effectiveness. If we believe, as Pete does, that empathy is the core of restorative justice, then somebody somewhere in the Ministry of Justice will be working out how to measure that. And we'll be working out how to count how many times Pete hits the empathy button, whatever it might be, every time he meets with a group of people brought together through an act of harm. So the risk in that is that victims become to be used as a tool to develop offender empathy, which would be a travesty of restorative justice. And if victims feel that, and most of them are very quick to know when they're being used, they will be reluctant to participate. And so there will be very few face-to-face meetings. There'll be a lot of indirect and shuttles, there'll be a lot of letters written. Or people will just say, well, let's forget about restorative justice. Surely we can just do it through a victim empathy program. And let's forget about victims because they're too awkward and they're too difficult to engage. And that's that's maybe a bit of an overgeneralization, but that would be my worry if we just stick to those discourses of restorative justice. Having said that, there's a lot within those two discourses that I support. Both discourses put the performance of the expert practitioner at the centre, and I'll come back to that. In the meantime, what was happening in Europe? So I think when you travel around Europe and talk to people who are involved in restorative justice and other areas, they talk about human rights a lot more than we do over here. In fact, in the current political discourse, human rights is becoming something of a dirty word. That we really want to push back human rights. It's a European thing, and it's interfering in our sovereignty. But it's a very important thing. I remember sitting in Portugal, raving about some new ideas or something about rehabilitating young people and restorative justice with young people. And this very pleasant professor of criminology was listening to me and nodding and smiling to himself. And after I sort of finished boasting about the great things that we were doing, he said, but you know, Tim, in Portugal, we wouldn't think of rehabilitating young people until they're 16 because that's our age of criminal responsibility. 16. In Northern Ireland it's 10. So obviously we have to rehabilitate 12-year-olds because they're up in court for offending. It doesn't happen in Portugal. So there's a completely different discourse that is created by a human rights approach. Generally, as a result, they're not as punitive. There's exceptions to that. But generally, when you're in Belgium, Finland, Germany, there isn't that sort of uptightness about law and order that you get in our political discourse. They're much more relaxed about it. There is a strong sense of social pedagogy that children need to be developed, not just by sitting in school, but through experience, learning from experience, through the guidance of wise adults. And there is a lot of restorative justice, but they call it mediation, victim-offender mediation. And it's a much simpler approach. It's a pragmatic approach. A judge thinks, do you know what, I think this would be a lot easier if you two went and met, sorted out how much you owe each other, and come back to me and see if I agree with that. Much more pragmatic, and it's not really to do with our obsession about reoffending. It's to do with meeting the victim's needs. That's what they say. They don't get into this, oh, well, you know, when if you're in England or Ireland, if somebody says, does restorative justice work? They're not asking about victims, are they? They're asking you, what are the reoffending rates? So mediation, not so much. It's saying victim has been in some way unjustly treated, and can the perpetrator and the victim go away and sort out how to put it right again? And if that's okay, let me know as the judge, and I'll represent it. So no strong focus on reoffending. You're not going to find a lot of literature on the effectiveness of mediation for reoffending. And critical social theory. As I said earlier on, and as Theo said, I think almost every reference we've looked at today has been an English-speaking author. Now that's natural, because we probably don't speak a lot of foreign language. But there's a whole rich literature in Europe of critical social theory, rather than the sort of empiricist, positivist sort of research that we've been talking about. And through the alternative program, we've been looking at this because we're looking at intercultural conflict, etc. So people like Foucault, talking about discourse, which has influenced me, the different discourses of restorative justice. Bourdieu is talking about the field, which is really what Theo was talking about. He was saying that every area of activity has a field in which people contest ideas and compete for resources, and there's a politics going on. And restorative justice is just another field like that. Hannah Arendt and Ricoeur and Derrida, they have all really very interesting things to say about forgiveness, about narrative. And Habermas, who's a big influence on me, and I'll come back to him, makes a very interesting analysis of the very things that I've begun to talk about, and Theo was talking about how the system will, to use his word, colonize ordinary community work, life, civil society, what he calls the life world, which is, I think, is where restorative justice resides. Ordinary people trying to sort things out. But the system cannot resist trying to take over and regulate and interfere with. And that can create what he calls social pathologies. Northern Ireland, very quickly, and I'm just using this as a test case because it is the context in which I'm coming from. So in Northern Ireland, the law has said for young people who admit offences, restorative justice is mandatory. Now, not mandatory to the young person or the victim, mandatory to the system. And this annoyed the life out of judges, as you can imagine. A judge has to ask the young person, will they agree to a conference for the victim? No choice, other than murder, because there's a mandatory sentence. But anything that isn't mandatory, they have to say, do you want to witness? The vast majority do. And for that reason, there's been a lot of conferences. Over 15,000 in the last 10 years. There's a full-time agency, and there's coordinators who do nothing else but coordinate conferences. There's a high level of victim satisfaction and participation. We at Ulster University were commissioned to draw up the model and do the training, and that was our first priority. How do you engage victims? Because looking at the research, we sense that almost everybody who's involved in restorative justice comes from an offender, working with offender background. And they're scared and lacking in confidence and basically incompetent when it comes to talking to victims. They can talk to offenders and they feel that's their comfort zone. And so I don't know how many youth offending teams I've been to when the sort of victim people come up and say, we cannot get people to talk to victims, we cannot get people to refer victims. We're here saying, we want to help. But victims are not getting a fair shot. And I don't think it's necessarily anti-victim, I think it's lack of confidence. They're anxious about meeting victims. They think it's going to be horrible. I'm not going to be able to cope with it. They'll be too angry, or they'll be too sad, or they'll be traumatized. I don't know how to do it. I can deal with a 14-year-old thug, but I can't deal with a victim in tears. So we put a high emphasis on that to try and raise victim participation, and I think we've done quite well. Not well enough, but quite well. It does reduce reoffending. We do have statistical, because we can compare what happened before restorative justice with probation orders and community service orders, but there's also a few young people who don't go the restorative way, and we can see how they do. And it's around a 20% better rate for reducing reoffending restorative. I want to mention Niels Christie as another European influence. He was the one that says us academics, professionals, state people steal the conflict. We take it away from the protagonists. We usually do it by focusing on the offender and making the victim, as he says, invisible. The victim disappears. Either focusing on punishing the offender or offering the offender therapy. In both cases, the victim seems to melt into the background. And Niels Christie's thesis is restore the conflict, the harm to the people who are closest to it. And to a certain extent, I don't think the legislators in Northern Ireland realised that that's what they were doing, but to a certain extent it's the closest that I've seen, because it's the victim and the offender decides where the conference happens. But that means it has to be a very inclusive and very flexible system. We did not adopt the script. We don't think one approach fits all. So what do you do if either the offender or the victim, and this has happened many times, either of them are autistic and challenged in their ability to connect with another person emotionally, particularly strangers. So we have to write up new guidelines for that. We've had to deal with a lot of sexual harmful cases that I suspect a lot of people would avoid, a lot of domestic violence cases, just because if they agreed to a conference, it had to go ahead. The practitioner cannot say that case isn't suitable. Niels Christie also writes about the ideal victim and the ideal offender. And there is a danger in the British system that on the basis of research or just inclination, that people are looking for the ideal victims and the ideal offenders to meet, as opposed to the real people, who are not ideal. We can be very angry, can be obnoxious, and I mean both victims and offenders. And we've had conferences that didn't go well, but everybody was glad it happened. I don't have time to tell you those stories, if you're interested in later stage. So it has to be real. If you believe that restorative justice, as I do, can be a core way of us all living together in one society, whether it's through justice, skills, etc. If you believe it's just an interesting side project that may be suitable for some people, then you might have a different discourse. But I believe it's an exciting idea that goes to the core of how people live together in society. What if we look at restorative justice through a social lens? And as I say, you have different discourses that have influenced. There's a sort of indigenous post-colonial discourse of the Maoris and the Aborigines and the sort of Native Americans, circles and family group conferences. You have a psychological therapeutic discourse that it's about feelings, it's about helping people to feel better and to heal. And you have then the sort of system discourse is, does it stop reoffending or what? What if we looked at it through a social lens and saw it as a social process, as I think fits a European context better? In Ulster, we talk about the aim of restorative justice is simple, it's to restore justice. That word, funny enough, is very rarely mentioned. And in fact, there's a movement to get away from justice, and we talk about restorative practices. We don't hold with that. People sort of make the distinction, restorative justice, that's a criminal justice thing. As if police officers, probation officers, judges, and prisons have the monopoly of justice. You will know, if you run a family, that there are issues of justice and fairness every day if you've got kids, or if you're trying to live with your partner. You will know of schools. We talk about restorative practices in schools. Most of the issues are around justice and fairness in schools, in my experience. So justice needs to be reclaimed as a core concept in our society, and not to be avoided. And so what I mean by that, restorative justice engages those most affected by an injustice in a process that restores what has been lost, damaged, and violated by the harm that has resulted from that injustice. So a crime is an injustice. But what we're interested in is how did that crime affect the victim? What is the harm? And how can what has been lost, damaged, or violated in some way be restored in that case? It's a social process. These are just some of the ideas that we use in Ulster. The problem is not the person, the problem is the problem. That's a quote from Michael White. Again, he's an Australian, he's actually dead now, worked in narrative work, but he borrowed a lot from people like Foucault and Derrida. And I think that's one of the things that's really hard for us, people like myself who've worked in the criminal justice system, is to unhook ourselves that the problem is always the person. Because the system processes people. It catches them, it tries them, it assesses them, it sentences them, it tries to hold them in one place or supervise them. We're obsessed with the person who's committed the harm. And the strange thing about doing that is that we don't pay a lot of attention to the crime or the harm, the actual thing that caused it. We become obsessed with the person. So I think that's a useful thing to see. And the problem, from my point of view, is in unjust harm, the event and its consequences, the actual thing that happened, as opposed to does this person need therapy? Does this person need punishment? Focus on the actual event. And the narrative truth of each individual includes the feelings and needs that arise from the harm. That's the storytelling. That carries people's emotions, but also their needs. Each party must communicate with the other to have their needs met and to be released from their relationship to the harm. They're brought together by the harm, I agree with Pete. That doesn't necessarily mean they have a relationship with each other. Both parties have a relationship to the harm. And if they don't disentangle, which is the word I think is quite good, it's being used today, themselves from that harm, then that harm will continue to dominate their lives. And that goes for the perpetrator as much as the victim. They need to find, the perpetrator needs to say, I am no longer identified with that terrible thing I did. I can be a different person now. And the victim needs to say, that terrible thing that happened to me does not need to dominate. I'll never forget it. I'll never lose the pain, but it doesn't need to dominate my every moment. And for us, that is what we're trying to do with restorative justice. So in that sense, in the earlier models, they tend to stress the performance of the practitioner. In this model, it's what the parties are enabled to do, rather than the facilitator, the practice of the parties. And the role of empathy then. I think we use a lot of, in our training, empathy, because it helps to draw people in and engage with a very difficult process. If they feel that the facilitator has empathy, they're more likely to tell that facilitator the story and engage with the process. And it also helps them to really dig deep into the story. However, it may discourage people to go beyond feelings onto the needs and to the actions. And I think it's the point you were making about catharsis. The critique of catharsis is, oh, I feel better now, as opposed to, I need to take some action to change it. And I think for us, the action to change is important. So the problem in some of the literature, whereas I read in a book recently on the effect script theory, is the antidote to shame is empathy. So the antidote of almost any distressing emotion is empathy. In other words, you can diffuse that horrible feeling if somebody understands you. But personally, I don't believe that. I think the antidote, the reason you get rid of those horrible feelings is when you do something about it. You do something about the cause. So we have a very simplistic formula, which is just a starting point. If the harm creates fear in the victim, then their need is for safety. If the harm creates anger in the victim, their need is for justice to be done. If the harm creates anxiety, they need to get a sense of control over their lives. If the harm creates shame, they need respect. Empathy is not their need. Empathy is maybe a vehicle for communicating, but it doesn't actually meet the need. And we train our facilitators to understand the feelings of the victim or the offender is expressing through their story and identify what their needs. And as Pete said earlier on, offenders and victims have the same needs, but they take very specific individual forms of those needs. They need to be very specifically. So a facilitator needs to understand what all the parties need in order to design the conditions for the parties to meet those needs. To bring in your point about design. Empathy may create the emotional connection, which deepens the dialogue. I've seen that many times. So I would say, unlike Pete, that I don't think empathy is a driver, but actually it can be an enabler. It can also be a disabler. But I think it's a product of dialogue. If people talk with each other, they're more likely to be empathetic, as opposed to having it already. Social theory of restorative justice, in my mind, would say it requires space for communicative action, which is a term from Habermas, that is not dominated by the system's strategic action. That a facilitator isn't going in and saying, I need to get them to feel empathetic because that's going to reduce reoffending. That is going to upset the autonomy of each of the parties. We must develop and sustain a culture of justice in society through respect, responsibility and equity. It supports social cohesion and social inclusion and socializes the individuals through clarifying and reinforcing social norms. This is what you did wrong, this is why it's wrong, we expect you not to do it again. So those, to me, are social outcomes of a restorative process. I'm going to finish up with a couple of stories. The persistent offender who said it worked. One of the things we discovered, we didn't predict, was if conferences, restorative conferences are mandatory, then you're going to get them again and again and again. And why not, if you're an offender? Of course, if you've got the purpose of criminal justice is to reduce reoffending, you will immediately conclude, why are we doing this if it doesn't work? But it really depends how what you judge is what is working. Now, this was the soft underbelly of restorative conferencing in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland aroused a lot of controversy, and there were a lot of people who were threatened and wanted it to fail. And they immediately seized on this. There was 0.05 of offenders at multiple conferences. By multiple, I mean more than 5. Some had 15. So if you're conditioned to thinking in criminal justice way, you're thinking, this is crazy. It's only crazy if you forget there's a victim. If you've made the victim invisible, as the system does. If your house is broken into tonight, hopefully not, and you really want to meet the victim, and somebody comes to you and says, no, we only actually do restorative conferences for first offenders, you're not going to meet the victim. You're going to realize the criminal justice system is not designed for victims. It's designed for offenders. So there are multiple conferences. So I was at a conference, and this judge, who has gone from skepticism to complete support of restorative justice, was on the panel. And I was just waiting for somebody to ask the question, what do you think of multiple conferences? Surely it doesn't make sense to keep sending the same young person again and again and again to a conference. And he said, yes, I understand that. It's caused me a lot of thought too. But I'll tell you a story that happened this very morning. I had this young fellow up in front of me, and I said to him, I know you, don't I? He said, yes, sir. Yes, I've been up a few times with you. And this is your 6th youth conference. Now, you really have to offer it. He said, before I offer you a conference, just tell me why I should offer you another conference. It's obviously not working with you. Oh, sir, it is working. It's working very well. So could you please explain to me how it's working? He said, could you look at what I did last time? He looked and said, yes, you were guilty of a burglary. Can you look at what I did this time? Yes, shoplifting. See, you've given up the burglaries. Now, actually, this young person was making a serious point. I have learned by meeting somebody who owns a house that I've broken into, you shouldn't do that. But what's the problem with stealing from HMV? I haven't, I don't know what, in my 14-year-old mind, I don't know what the problem is. It's a big store, I'm not hurting anybody, they're not going to miss one CD. And the judge was quite impressed with that. And actually that silenced the audience, at least for the time being. Here's another boy who taught me a lesson about empathy. I was doing research and I was sitting outside the conference room, as we call it. And this young fellow was sitting there, nervously waiting to go in to meet his victim. So I thought, I'll sit down and have a chat with him. And we chatted away and feeling nervous. I said, so you're about to go in and meet the people you've harmed. How are you feeling about that? I don't know. I said, these are people you offended against. You're going to have to talk to them. They're going to talk to you. So, what are you feeling about what you did? I don't know. So at this moment, I could feel I was getting a bit irritated. And I wasn't being very restorative. So I just said, well, look, here, young man. You're going in to see your victim. Are you not feeling sorry? He said, I don't know. So I thought, right, hold back, Tim, hold back. And I said, okay, that's interesting. Can you tell me why you don't know if you're feeling sorry or not? And he said to me the most restorative thing that I've heard, the wisest thing I said. How do I know what I'm sorry about until I hear what the victims have to say? Isn't that so wise? Here I am, a so-called expert. I didn't think of that. And that, to me, is the effort to understand. He was preparing himself for what those lads said to me, to make the effort to understand somebody else. And he wasn't thinking, I'm going to have to make it up in my imagination. The whole thing about dialogue, the whole thing about a conference, is you meet the person and you don't have to guess. You just have to listen really carefully. And then you'll understand how you've affected somebody else. And then you will decide what you're sorry about. And that, to me, is the essence of restorative justice. And I needed a 14-year-old to tell me that. Because I'd never read that in the books. But he got it. Just to finish, I think what I'm thinking about is we use this concept in our research of thick and thin. And I'll not explain it all. It comes from an anthropologist called Peters. So there's thin empathy, which I'm dubious about. It's about the system strategically looking for a process that will give them a quick and easy, feel-good response. And it will look good, and it will be managed by the experts. And my fear is that's the way restorative justice is going in Britain. Thick empathy is what happens in the real world, the life world, as Habermas calls it. It's about communication. It's about that boy saying, I'm not going to go in and say I'm sorry just because everybody expects me to say I'm sorry. I'm going to listen to this other person with respect. And through communication, through dialogue, I will understand what I've done. And then I'll decide whether I'm sorry about it. I might decide I'm not sorry, as sometimes I do. But I will make the decision on the basis of communication. And it takes time and it takes effort. It's not easy. I don't think it can be scripted. Sometimes people feel bad at the end of a conference, and the conference has gone really well. Because that's reality. There isn't a magic wand in every case. I do connect with what people are saying, because I have heard and I've seen things that I thought were magical. People have come into rooms angry, upset, and have walked, literally, I've seen victims at the end of a conference say to the young person, and this is a true story, I'm going to give you a job. That's what you need. So there can be magical transformations, so-called. But sometimes it doesn't turn out that way. Sometimes the offender has an obnoxious attitude, and the victim has to hear that. And then I say to the victim, I'm really sorry that happened. I'm not. Now I know what he's like. I have information that I didn't have before. It wasn't pleasant, but I'm glad I did it. So it needs to look great, it needs to be facilitated skillfully, as opposed to be managed towards a preconceived outcome. Thanks very much.